Start. Welcome everyone to the special meeting of Council for the 10th of June 2020. I'd like to start the meeting by acknowledging the Aboriginal parties whose songlines traverse the lands we meet on today, the Western Waka Waka, Gibel and Jarrawa peoples, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So I acknowledge the Portfolio Leader of Planning and Development, Councillor Carl, welcome the Mayor, Councillor Paul Antonio, Deputy Mayor, Councillor McDonald, Councillors, Chief Executive Officer Brian Pidgeon, General Manager Planning and Development Stuart Summers, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of the media. So we don't have any apologies, obviously. Can I have a mover for confirmation of the previous minutes of the special meeting held 27th of May 2020? Councillor Antonio, have a seconder. Councillor McDonald. All those in favour? It's carried. Is there any business arising from the previous minutes? Can I please have a mover for suspension of standing orders? Councillor Taylor, Councillor Von Hoff, all those in favour? It's carried. So we move to item 6, which is the combined material change of use impact extension to retirement facility. We're going to have the presentation by Shakita Safara to present to us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This report outlines a development application for extension to a retirement facility and boundary realignment, 2 lots into 2 lots at Hawke Street in Cranley. Wendy, please, can we open the first attachment? The subject land comprises 2 lots. That are located in a low-density residential zone, and 1 lot. Can we go to the figure 2, please?
Sorry, you missed that.
Wendy, can we please move to figure 2? Thank you. Yes. There. So. The subject land comprises 2 lots that are located in low-density residential zone and 1 lot that is located in 4,000 square meters minimum precinct of the rural residential zone, according to the planning scheme mapping. Can we please go to figure 3? Thank you. The subject land includes areas of within the environmental significance, a bushfire hazard, and also airport environs overlays.
Can't see that.
No.
It's not working.
No, it should be working, but there you are. So that one is areas of ecological significance and showing, and areas of ecological significance and bushfire hazard overlays. Please, can we move to figure 1? Two of the lots in a low-density residential zone contain the retirement facility that includes 555 individual dwellings and also ancillary outbuildings. It also includes temporary caravan parking that is located in the northern end of the site. So it's just over here. The northern part of the subject site is planned for approved stages 5, 6, and 7 of the retirement facility. Okay, sorry. It's difficult to show, but there you are. So this part is planned for stages 5, 6, and 7. And the temporary caravan parking is located at the site that is planned for stage 6 units. The retirement facility has access to all infrastructure and also services, and has access from Hawke Street and Tor Street. Just over here and here. The subject land on the corner of Green Wattle and Hawke Street contains existing dwelling house and ancillary shed, and includes areas of ecological significance. Can we please go to figure 3, please?
Excuse me, Madam Chair.
Yes.
There's probably not much point, certainly from this end of the room, for you to use that red thing, because I certainly can't see it. I'm not sure how many other people around the table can.
I'm in trouble.
So I'm just not sure what the best solution is. But
When we had the presentation, Councillor Summerfield, earlier with the arrow, was that, could you see that?
arrow is certainly
Yeah.
not more visible. Helpful.
Wendy.
Okay. Heath had the presentation up over there. We can't earlier.
No, you couldn't see it.
Couldn't see the arrow.
I can't see it non close, only when it's on pale. Yeah.
Okay.
We might have a solution.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Councillor Bonner.
rulers.
A really long broom. Yes, handle, that's right. We're innovative here at council, don't worry.
Sometimes it just comes up.
Between the two of us was
It's faulty, it's not always working, Stuart. That's the
Maybe a high jump.
Okay, we're going to try and use the arrow, are we? Is that?
Is it on?
I think it's the top one.
Have you turned it on at the side? Sit at Wendy's computer.
got a big long.
Is it better?
Presentation?
Yes.
I can see here. I'll tell her where it is. We'll put it on. We'll do both.
Okay, no, we've got, okay,
Okay.
you're right.
So the corner lot that located on the corner of the Green Wattle and Hawke Street, this subject site, contains the subject site that contains areas of ecological significance, and also mapping planning scheme mapping shows that the waterway traverses the site. However, the applicant provided environmental assessment report that states the site contains only woodland vegetation, and no riparian or alluvial vegetation was observed on that particular site. This lot is serviced by unsealed driveway crossover from Hawke Street, and have access to all infrastructure services, and except sewer. The subject site is surrounded by low-density residential uses to the south. Can we please go to the figure 1, Wendy? So to the south, and rural residential uses to the west and north. Can we please open attachment 2? Attachment 2. Second attachment, Lindsay.
Second attachment. The attachment or the figure?
The
Attachment, yeah.
attachment number 2. There is this attachment number 2. Is it? Thank you. The intent of the proposed boundary alignment is to provide an additional area for retirement facility to accommodate the ancillary caravan parking. The proposed boundary alignment would result in 2 lots. The proposed lot 20 that will have an area of 33 hectares and will contain the retirement facility and ancillary caravan parking. And the proposed lot 21 that will have an area of 1.7 hectares and would contain the proposed detention basin that will be located within the services easement in the benefit of proposed lot 20. This lot will be vacant land located in the rural residential zone. Can we please go to the figure 2? Oh, the next figure 3, sorry. The proposed extension to retirement facility includes 67 caravan parking spaces, wash bay, and also will retain the dwelling house to be used as relief caretakers accommodation. So, yeah, please, I can't do it. Okay. According to a submitted traffic report, the proposed caravan parking will generate about 2 to 3 vehicle trips per day and will operate from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. The proposed ancillary caravan parking will replace the existing temporary caravan parking and would be serviced by new vehicle access from Hog Street. Can we please go to the next figure? So the proposed wash bay will be located at the northern end of the caravan parking and will include oil separator and also will include 5,000 liter holding tank for wastewater. The wastewater will be collected by licensed contractor. According to the stormwater management plan provided by the applicant, the stormwater quality and quantity will be managed through the detention basin and bioretention basins. Wendy, please, can we go to the next figure? Yes. Can we please go to the next figure? Figure 5, please. So this figure shows the concept of the detention basin that is proposed in lot 21. This is detention. Can we please open attachment 3, please? Can we go down to page 5? Just down to the landscape plan, please. Further down. The proposal includes landscaping throughout the development site, and it includes landscaping, screen vegetation along the Hog Street frontage, landscaping within the detention basin, and also screen planting along the northern and western edges of the caravan parking. This development application is subject to impact assessment and has undergone public notification. there were 2 properly made submissions opposing the development. Those submissions raised issues related to the development to inconsistency of the development with the intents of the zone, related to stormwater, noise, air quality, and lighting impacts, and the lack of wastewater infrastructure. It is considered that those issues were addressed through the information provided by the applicant, and where applicable, the impacts can be managed through the imposition of relevant and reasonable conditions. Those issues were addressed in this report. Can we please open attachment 4?
Attachment 4.
Ergon Energy was an advice agency for the application and had no requirements to the proposed development. This is the response from Ergon Energy. The proposed development is considered to be genuinely complying with the relevant assessment benchmarks of the Toowoomba Regional Planning Scheme. Where applicable, the development can be conditioned to comply with the relevant assessment benchmarks. Other relevant matters supporting the development were also considered, including the fact that the proposed development would provide an opportunity for completion of the final stages of the retirement facility, whilst maintaining the provision of ancillary caravan parking for the residents of the facility. Accordingly, it is recommended that the proposed development to be approved, subject to reasonable and relevant conditions.
Okay, thanks, Shakita. Under trying circumstances, we'll have that fixed up by the time you have to come back next time. Thank you very much. Councillors, any questions for the planners? Councillor Summerfield.
Thank you. Should we be suspending standing orders?
I thought I did do that.
Done it. Sorry, I didn't think we had. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. So I just wondered, I wanted a bit of clarity around whether this is actually car parking or caravan parking or caravan storage. And from that I flow on to managing sewerage.
According to the proposed development, it's ancillary caravan parking that would be that will service the residents of the retirement facility.
So it would be caravan storage only?
Yes.
Be no one living in them?
No.
And there'd not be a need for a dump point or anything there, given that the people would be travelling and come back? They would have to come back with an empty sewage in their caravan? Would have to be pumped out before they come back?
Yes, there is no disposal. Well, there will be a 5,000 litre tank, but it's only will hold the wastewater from Wash Bay. All the wastewater from caravans will have to be disposed prior to entering the site.
So is that
caravan
actually
parking.
clarified have we seen a plan of how they're allowed to use that storage? That we ensure that that is the case?
Apologies, councillors. Sorry. Any effluent from use of toilets and what have you within the caravans or mobile homes or whatever we call them will have to be disposed of off the site. There is no ability to, plug in and pump your waste out on the site. Shakita was referring to the only tanks or storage areas that will be on site are for any wastewater. So if someone takes their caravan up to the rear of the site to the wash bay and hoses it down and cleans it, that runoff or anything from that will be collected into a large tank, and then intermittently when it fills it will be pumped out, but there will be no sewerage effluent in the sense of human waste that will be disposed of on that site, except if someone's living in the caretaker's residence.
Okay, thank you. So I'd just like to think that that was actually clarified to anyone who was using that for storage, that that was the case, and I'm not sure how we would manage that. So then the other question I had was around the landscaping, the timeline for the landscaping to be done, and is it mature plantings?
Landscaping requirements. For landscaping. As you will see, councillors, there's a number of landscape concept plans attached to this report. The requirements for landscaping are contained from conditions or proposed conditions 98 within the report. Basically, they need to establish the landscaping, and it needs to be established prior to the commencement of use. I understand there will probably be more detailed landscape plans submitted to council for further assessment, and our landscape expert will determine what pot size, as I call them, will be required in terms of maturity of plantings.
Okay, thank you. And one last question, if I could, and that was around the PO1, the performance outcome that this application didn't meet, and wanting to know whether staff are comfortable with the fact that that this application hasn't met.
Yes, councillors, that has been considered. With the implementation of the Planning Act, the test for assessing compliance or non-compliance with a planning scheme changed from what it was under the Sustainable Planning Act. So councillors may recall that we used to talk about there's an inconsistency with the planning scheme, but there are sufficient grounds to support approval of a development despite the conflict. That's no longer the test. So now what officers have to do under the Planning Act, and it's been confirmed through, there's a primary case called Ashvan, which the judge set out the principles of assessment under the Planning Act. So what we need to do is look at the assessment benchmarks, so look at compliance or otherwise with the planning scheme, and you've rightly pointed out that there's PO1, it's rural residential land, so using it for this purpose obviously isn't consistent with that. But the next step that council officers need to take in assessment is to actually weigh up the compliances, the non-compliances, and any other what they call relevant matters, and do a balancing act in terms of that assessment to reach a resolution as to whether they believe that a recommendation should be for approval or not. So an application can actually not comply with an assessment benchmark, but still on balance, taking all the considerations into account, be considered appropriate for approval. And that's the case in this instance, where we've considered it's contiguous to the existing retirement village. By relocating the temporary caravan storage, it allows those balanced stages of the retirement village to develop. They've provided some pretty good landscape concept plans which clearly indicate that the site in terms of visual amenity and just from an aesthetics perspective can be appropriately landscaped. They've done work in the context of we were concerned around cut and fill, and we didn't want a situation where there might be huge giant retaining walls, so they've done some work in relation to that. So taking into account a whole range of factors, on balance the officer has weighed those up and resolved with a recommendation that the application should be approved.
Thanks, Danielle.
Thank you. Councillor McMahon.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to raise, it seems like, to me, a bit of a concern that in this Lot 21, which is the area of ecological significance and a waterways and wetlands buffer, and right next to it we have the caravan washing bay, albeit with an oil separator and a holding tank. This is down the hill from that, so residue, I don't know what people wash their caravans with, but where does residue wash off into that?
No, it's designed so that any residue or runoff from the washing of the caravans goes into that, I don't know the politically correct term, but the pit, I'll call it, so the tank. And it's sort of like service stations where when the liquid reaches a certain height, there's alerts that come that says, you know, you need to look at getting the tank pumped out. So it collects everything. There's alerts when it gets to a certain level to ensure that it never overtops and it's pumped out. So, you know, we can ask our environmental officer if he's got anything else to add, because I'm not an environmental specialist, but that's how we understand it works, such that there should be no residual runoff into those adjoining areas.
As long as council's satisfied that it collects all of the runoff, doesn't leave like a...
From the wash bay and any, you know, car wash or anything that they're using on the caravans, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I just had a similar question along those same sort of lines. So is it over some sort of grate or something like that, is it?
There's a specifically designed wash bay, and it's designed with, you know, grades that ensure that anything coming off it run into that underlying underground tank, and then it gets pumped out, so it captures everything. It's designed to capture everything.
Okay, thanks, Danielle. Councillor Carol Taylor?
Madam Chair, look, I note here the stormwater there, the runoff is quite major and causes quite some impacts. Are we satisfied with the measures we have in here that we're going to, there is no worsening in that area?
Yes, I can defer to our engineering team members if they'd like to clarify.
Through you, Madam Chair. Certainly, Councillor, the proposed approval would be subject to an operational works application and subsequent approval, obviously, but we're confident that the area that is there, we have proof of concept in a general term, the volume of the storage that we could achieve there relative to the impervious area. Certainly, it needs an operational works application for both that and also water quality treatment from the stormwater area, as well as quantity.
Quite steep in places up in that land. There's a lot of runoff. So if we're confident, thank you, Dave. Thank you very much.
Councillor Carl?
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair, thank you. Just a question further to the washdown bay questions that have been asked and the capacity of the 5,000 litre tank. My question is specifically around potential waiting times, or is there any mandatory instruction to the applicant upon arrival to this site that vehicles are washed down straight away? And the reason why I ask that, there are some off-road RV vehicles or campers that traverse all sorts of terrain all over the countryside, and I mean potentially all over Australia. I know with our own fleet there are mandatory washdown requirements from one part of the region to the other, sometimes with pest and weed control. So my question is, here's the scenario. An RV comes in, sits there for potentially a month without any regulation to have washdown. There's a heavy rainfall, and further to Councillor Tim's concerns, there is overflow into that water collection area, detention basin, with noxious weed seeds off a vehicle, and we have a protected area there, some remnant vegetation. So how do we deal with that? Are we putting a regulation that upon arrival those vehicles must be washed down rather than left sit to avoid that possible scenario?
Good question. District Quinlan, are you going to answer that for us? Thank you.
Through you, Madam Chair. Certainly, Councillor, I would like to point out, and our environmental scientists may wish to add to this, but in a general sense, if you imagine a service station that you would drive to today, the bunded area, if you actually look, the bunded area where you fuel, that goes into a sump. Now, the parking area, this large parking area, which would generate quite a lot of stormwater, you rightly point out, that does not go to the sump, but just the washdown bay area. So general stormwater, if that's the right term, would not go and fill up and overflow this basin. Your concerns, Councillor Carr, about weeds being brought in and that sort of thing from elsewhere around the state, and certainly somebody who has lived in areas where there has been quarantines for things like, or various weeds. I would point out that the local shopping centre or any large shopping centre probably represents a greater risk with cars travelling in and then subsequently dropping soil and seeds. I would say that this is a site where we would not seek to offset the water quality works, but would rather construct works as part of the detention basin that seek to capture that initial flow and ostensibly to take nitrates and phosphates out of it. But that has the benefit of also capturing seeds and silt and that sort of thing. So it would be good practice, obviously, to look at these sort of structures that capture this initial runoff from these areas as a water quality thing. It can potentially be a place where seeds congregate, but the advantage is by going through that treatment first, it doesn't necessarily enter the entire waterway. While weed seeds aren't a specific criteria in water quality treatment, they are by default, like metals and other certain contaminants are picked up in those rain garden type structures.
That's all well and good until those seeds grow into weeds and then seed in turn and then a spread. Regardless of a buffer or not, can find themselves over the other side of that bunding and into the local environment or ecosystem. Unlike a shopping centre, I'm talking about RV vehicles that don't necessarily traverse sealed or unsealed roads. They actually do get to places where there are things that we need to worry about being brought into our local environment. Given that this is a specific use and not a shopping centre car park, I would like to see that the requirement from the operator, the owner of this facility, a requirement is put on them for the residents that immediately upon entry or very soon as practical, given that the 5,000 litre tank might be near full and the alarm goes off, that they are asked to have their vehicles in a clean state after returning to minimise risk, given that this is a specific use site.
I might ask the officers to respond to the practicalities of that. Whether it can be conditioned, I guess, or whether that's a reasonable condition.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Councillor.
I refer to our organisation that has the same sorts of requirements in managing their fleet and contamination across this region, let alone interregional and interstate.
If I could, through you, Madam Chair, I would make the point that certainly weed seed spread is a significant consideration. Those of us who've been involved in it, and certainly with council activity, particularly the mowing of sides of roads and this sort of thing, weed seed spread has certainly occurred in the past. That's true. I think we have a range of people who travel through Toowoomba, a range of people who travel from the west and other places and then back to those areas. The risk that the 100,000 residents pose by travelling in their cars, many of them off-road, I think may be greater than the risk of a caravan parking area that then goes through a water quality treatment. It would be my view, but I certainly, others may have another view.
Is there anyone, the environmental officer wanted to, General Manager Stewart?
I might just remind councillors that we're talking about a retirement village here, grey nomads. Not a lot of them leave the tarred roads. The worst they do is gravel roads. I don't imagine them bush bashing and doing all the exciting things that people under the age of 25 do. with their vehicles. And also they tend to be pretty proud of their caravans and other things, and they tend to keep them clean anyway. But I think if there isn't a condition in relation to washing down the vehicle and keeping it clean upon arrival, then we could put a condition in that the developer have a sign at the entrance saying, please wash down vehicle upon arrival, or something like that. That's probably all we could do in terms of assisting in the management of that aspect. What are your thoughts there? Yep. So we could look at an amendment to the recommendation with a condition about signage in regard to that matter. Yep.
Do you have a follow-up, Councillor Carl?
Yeah, I would be comfortable with that, Mr Summers. Just a minor correction. Not all people are retirees in Palm Lake either. Some of them do lead active lives. I know a couple of them, and they do tow RV vehicles around, and they do get off-road, and they are quite active, and they're not old. I just think that it's a minor thing to ask to actually minimise potential risk, and we've experienced beyond Q100 downpours in this area quite frequently. So to minimise, that's a precaution we could take, and I don't believe it's unreasonable. And in fact, probably the owners of the facility would appreciate clean and tidy recreational vehicles, caravans and the like in that lot anyway.
Okay. So we're agreeing we're going to make an amendment to the conditions. Is that?
I think that's
Yeah,
the view of the room to make.
Okay. Councillor McMahon, did you have a...
Look, I was, don't need to add anything to Councillor Carl, but this is not 3 caravans, there's 70 parks here, and I appreciate that they don't always run at full capacity and future planning, etc., but there's a fair few large vehicles that are dirty parked there, so I support this.
Okay. Is there any further questions? Okay, councillors, I beg your pardon, Councillor Von Hoff.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Am I correct in saying if we're looking at figure 3, the waterways and wetlands buffer, that runs down into what eventually becomes Oakygary Creek? And are we confident that there's no chance with how the oil or any of those materials from the RVs and caravans, are we confident that there's no chance that will run off down into Oakygary Creek?
Thank you.
Through you, Madam Chair. Certainly, water quality devices are designed, and we're talking from the stormwater area here, if you like, the parking area, not the washdown bay. I think the washdown bay, the oils there would be held in this sump, so that will work quite well. The broader parking bay area, yes, by taking that through a water quality treatment garden device that we have, it is notionally designed to pull out nitrates and phosphates particularly. Hydrocarbons will sit in those areas. If I took a 44-gallon drum of oil and tipped it there, yes, eventually we would probably see that material go down. But in a car park like that, would it be worse than a shopping centre? Would it be worse than Ruthven Street? Would it be worse than Mort Street? I seriously don't think so. In fact, it would be better off than those which actually discharge directly to the creek system. So in comparison to what is the daily risk to the creek system from hydrocarbons, this represents a very, very low risk.
Councillor Antonio, did you have a question?
A little bit challenged by some of this discussion, wondering whether it's actually part of our responsibility or whether there are other areas of responsibility here, like state government overarching legislation in terms of this sort of thing. I'd certainly need a bit of advice before I could add this as an additional condition to a planning application like this.
Can I have someone respond? Thank you.
Through you, Chair. Mr Mayor, certainly in terms of water quality, there is the state planning policy which has provisions which we are required to consider in terms of assessing development applications. And to that extent, the water quality devices that we do, we have a planning scheme that refers to these things, but a water quality device, what it is particularly pursuing under the state planning policy is nitrate, phosphate and total dissolved solids, pH, these sorts of things. Hydrocarbons aren't specifically listed there, it is true, but for high-risk areas such as, well, service stations is a classic, we have typically a much more sophisticated approach there. Of course, there are other state provisions for these things. Also, if I had something like an oil recycling facility, that's certainly something where we would not, we would want site-specific water quality controls for that, more so than we'd want for, say, somebody who was operating a car yard, for instance, where they were selling cars, where the risk is far less than it would be on what are industries that are more likely to contaminate the ground. But yes, there is a state planning policy, and yes, we do consider that in terms of water quality. It does not specifically talk about weed seed spread, Mr Mayor, that is correct.
Councillors, as you know, there are legislative requirements around the spread of noxious weeds, and obviously there's obligations around the, I guess, maintenance or prevention of the spread of those. I've drafted a very basic condition around signage. I can read it out to you. There's always the possibility that the proponent could come and challenge as to whether this condition is reasonable and relevant for this development approval, but we can, if councillors wish, include the condition, and if they wish to challenge it subsequently, then we can deal with it on that basis. I've drafted a condition to the effect that a sign must be installed at the Hogg Street entry to the caravan storage area, directing that all caravans, motorhomes and the like proposed to be stored must immediately upon entry be washed down in the wash bay prior to being parked for storage.
Councillor McDonald.
Separate from that, just very quickly, have we got applicant or submitters to speak? I'll wait for that.
Okay. Well, if there's no further questions, councillors, Councillor Summerfield?
What's the process for whether we agree with that extra clause or not?
The washdown sign?
Yeah.
I was under the impression that we'd need to have someone to move that when we come out of standing orders. Have I got that process correct?
Reinstate standing order.
Yeah. Okay. So, Councillor McDonald, you said no, you were going to wait, yep. So, as you know, councillors, we usually have an opportunity now for either the submitters and the applicant to speak. So, we've only got one group to speak this afternoon from the submitter, and that is Mr. Greg Valla. So now, Mr. Valla, you will have 5 minutes to speak. You might like to come and sit up at this seat up here next to Councillor O'Shea with the microphone. Thank you. You do need to speak sort of closer to the microphone. It's a bit,
Madam Chair, councillors and staff, thanks for a chance to here this afternoon.
Greg, you'll have to speak up if you can.
Is that any better?
Give it a good yell.
Okay, we live on the property that has two boundaries to this Palm Lakes development, on our eastern and our southern boundary. So we have very close association with what is going on, and we wish to ask a couple of questions. One is, in extending the Palm Lakes lot, is this now a new medium density housing area? And because if it was, that would basically mean extending the area by stealth. And because the current lots in that Palm Lakes area are actually only 300 to 350 square metres. In fact, they should be 500 square metres, so I'm not sure how that got past council planning. The existing plan and future plans now, I'm not sure what the applicant plans to do with the remainder of the land, but hearsay is that they would like to put a motel on that land now. That's why we're concerned about what would happen with any extension of the current rural residential area, or taking it away, and it becomes quite important. Now, going on to the dam, this detention basin would require the removal of quite a lot of vegetation that is actually quite rare in the area. Now you've got a bunya pine there. I think we've got the other one. That's the only two in the area, unless you go over to the next, down by the down well to the east over the slope past Tall Street. Now, both of those are sensitive, and then as you close off more and more of this area, we've noticed with the Palm Lakes development, we had a huge increase in wildlife, which subsequently died out. So any further extension just further degrades this area. Now, there's been a number of talks here too about leaks from caravans, and given that you're going to be parking these caravans and you do not have any emptying facility for treating sewage, it's more than likely that amongst 70 caravans there'll be quite a few there with oil and septic waste on board. And the likelihood of that leaking, if you've got 1 in 70 chance, well, that's not a very good chance. It's fairly high, and it means there's a fair likelihood we will be receiving that waste. The rainfalls have often, from the runoff from planning, going on the first development of Palm Lakes has often been exceeded, and we've seen excessive wash, not so much on our property, but on the ones just downstream where it's caused quite a lot of damage. So when, the likelihood of this dam overflowing is reasonable, given that if they've used the same runoff tables. Point number 4 would be, we have had a lot of problem with dust control during development. It went nearly 3 months without control on the first development. We ended up having to clean the entire house out, wash every bit of linen and bedding in the place from dust. And very significant, like when you come home in the middle of summer, you leave your windows open, you come back and you find your house is literally smeared with dust from one end to the other, so thick that you could more than write your name on any surface, including all the bedding. So I'm not sure how the council polices that, but it seems to take quite a few months. And then finally, who checks that the building is to the plans? Because if this is not done to the plans, we could suffer very significantly. And right now, we have a fence on our back boundary. The fences are not meant to be more than 3 metres high. The concrete sleeper structure goes to 3.5 metres at the highest, and that is not on the plans. The plans show a 45-degree or lesser slope, and those housing lots on the edge there are 350 square metres, which is where they get the extra 50 square metres by putting a vertical fence on our boundary. On top of that, they then put a 1.8 metre colour bond fence. So our back boundary fence is over 5 metres high in places, and it is already sloping into our place. So I'm not sure who's checking, whether it's council or what, but there doesn't appear to be sufficient checking going on. And there certainly doesn't appear to be control over the developers. So with that, I think we'll end our presentation. Thank you.
Well done, Greg. You've run right to time. That's perfect. So we've got a number of questions there. Are you going to answer those or?
No, we generally
No?
don't.
No. Okay. Sorry, beg your pardon.
Submitters' questions.
Not questions. Okay. Councillors, are there any questions for the submitter?
Maybe.
Councillor McDonald?
Question, yeah. Thanks, Mr. Vella. Thanks for coming along. Could you just let us know how long you've been there on the site? You've obviously been there before Palm Lake started.
19 years.
19 years. Thank you.
Madam Chair,
Beg your pardon? Yep. Any further follow-up to that, Councillor McDonald?
Not for Mr Vella, no.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr Vella, have you put those concerns of yours back through council, through the customer service call centre?
I have mentioned verbally, I haven't put them in writing yet.
I'll ask you to do that.
We will have to do that. But I still don't understand who checks it, because it would seem that council must at some stage check for general compliance with these, of the developer with the plans, and it doesn't appear to be happening at all.
No further questions, comments? Okay, thank you. So, thank you, Mr Vella. Yep. So, can I have someone move that we reinstate standing orders? Beg your pardon, sorry.
I do have some questions, if I could, for the officers. Just picking up on Mr Vella, some of his concerns, if I could, through you, Madam Chair, just to work through a few of those. First one was around changing this. Will that then impact and make it become a medium density housing area? First question.
Councillor, no. It doesn't, in effect, constitute a rezoning of the land. The only way that land gets rezoned if council passes a resolution to actually rezone the land. This development approval merely gives a right for this particular use to be undertaken on that site. If there is ever another use proposed, then it will in its own right trigger a development application which will be assessed against the planning scheme and other relevant considerations.
Thank you. So, next question. In regard to the detention basin and the sensitive bunya pines that were mentioned, is there any report or discussion through an environmental impact study in regard to that or the preservation of those?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay. Something that maybe needs a better look at through the operational plan, perhaps. The operational works might be something that we should note. In regard to the dust control, I note the timings of work, but do we have any measures in place for dust control within the...
Yes, councillors, there would be conditions proposed and suggested in the recommendation for approval. I'm just having a look here. For example, conditions 33 to 37 address sediment control and the like during construction. Luke can probably correct me. I don't know whether there's a 33 to 37. Also, often, while there are requirements imposed for construction to manage dust and sediments and the like, if there is ever a concern of a surrounding resident in relation to dust, then generally they will, if they're submitted to council, they will go through to council's development compliance team, and the development compliance team will go out and investigate the concerns and take any necessary action to try to resolve that issue.
Okay, and I guess if that's almost answered the final question, which was around the building, making sure that it is to plan, and particularly around the landscape and walls and what have you, and that would become an issue where a neighbour could make contact to council?
Yes, if a neighbour raised a concern, and we do get those concerns at times, then that will be investigated. In relation to landscaping, generally our landscape architect or even a compliance team member will go out once the landscaping is established to confirm that it actually complies with the endorsed landscape plan.
Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor McDonald. So just further to that then, the sort of idea of having this huge big fence and the amenity of that's covered off in the landscaping plan, I gather.
Well, to some extent in terms of the landscaping, but often in terms of cut and fill, that will sometimes be dealt with through the operational works approval for excavation and filling. So if they require operational works approval for that, then that would be addressed through that. It also could be addressed through the landscaping. I'm noting that they're proposing, batters and the like on here, which is aimed at trying to reduce the extent of cut over the site, so retaining. But yeah, there are further avenues where that can be reviewed and considered as to the appropriateness of that.
Thank you, Danielle. Councillor Carol Taylor?
Chair, that fence is already existing. It's not with the new one, I do believe, with the talking. With what has been mentioned, that fence is the existing development that's there, I think. I'm just worried about, I see the erosion and sediment control and I've read it, and I'm not sure it covers just the actual dust that comes from a building site. There's a lot of words in there and there are a lot of things mentioned, and I'm just not sure. Your sediment fences, earth beams, it doesn't actually say dust control.
Condition 31, all reasonable and feasible avoidance and mitigation measures are employed so that dust emissions generated during building works do not exceed nominated levels when measured at any sensitive place.
Thank you, Danielle. I started at 33.
Sorry,
So you're right.
Needed to go back.
That has covered it. Thank you very much.
Okay, Councillor Von Hoff.
Thanks, Madam Chair. If we could just go back to the point raised by Councillor McDonald, that was also raised by Mr Ballard, in regard to the vegetation removal in the detention basin, and in particular the bunya pines were referenced. Is it standard practice for that information about an environmental impact not to be assessed at the time of a development application, but rather during an operational plan?
No, if there are considered to be potential environmental impacts in the sense of what the planning scheme is concerned of in terms of environmental impacts, then they will be addressed during the assessment of the material change of use application. I'm guessing, and I'm not a vegetation expert, that council doesn't have a lot of controls around just general removal of trees. We used to have those that have been councillors long enough, I'm probably saying the wrong, but I think it used to be Local Law 19 that used to protect trees that were above a certain circumference in terms of the trunk, and you actually had to get a local law approval to remove those trees. Probably 9 or 10 years ago, Queensland brought in a whole range of what they called model local laws in the hope that Queensland councils would all adopt similar sets of local laws. And that local law around the protection of just any tree that was a certain circumference went. And council, to my knowledge, doesn't really have any other local or other controls around just specific, if there's trees sitting on a site that you can't remove those trees. It would only be if it's triggered under an environmental significance overlay such that we feel through the assessment that it needs assessment that it will be, and in this case obviously we've considered it hasn't triggered that detailed consideration under the planning scheme provisions.
Follow up, Councillor Von Hoff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So then a supplementary question then, I suppose it stands to reason then that wouldn't come up in an operational plan either.
Generally not.
Councillor Carol Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm looking at figure 2, and I'm wondering if those two big trees actually just on the boundary are two of the ones that have been discussed. There are two more further up to the north, but I'm wondering if they would be likely to be outside the area being developed anyway.
Councillor Taylor, is that on the
Figure 2,
The proposed
2 of 5 proposed.
the proposed?
reconfiguration plan?
Yes. They're outside the boundary. Yes, so I wonder if they're the two he's meaning. Those two up there. Well, those two are outside the boundary. Yeah, so they won't be touched, but it's those ones up there.
Do you want to say that?
That's what I mean. They won't be touched. Those two down there. Yeah. All I was pointing out, if those two, they won't be not inside the boundary, so they won't be removed. but the ones up to the north may.
Vegetation on the side.
I'd hate to see them
Yeah, just over the here, yes.
Madam Chair, I'd hate to see two large mature trees.
Yes, agreed. I'll just wait for a response from the officers.
Stick to the local environment. The applicant submitted environmental assessment report in response to submissions and stated that there are no riparian or alluvial vegetation on the site. And the detention basin location will be, the plantings will be in replacing the existing vegetation in the detention basin.
In the detention basin?
Yes.
Big-
In the area of the detention basin.
But we don't like trees in the detention basins.
Not in the detention basin, but around the detention basin.
So the detention basin, sorry, Madam Chair, just what you're saying, I think, is that the detention basin will be built not to disturb the trees. They'll be around the periphery.
Not necessarily. There would be excavation works undertaken to create the detention basin, which may involve the removal of existing vegetation. However, what they would do once they've constructed the detention basin is be required to reinstate some landscaping and trees and what have you around that detention basin.
Yes, but in our conditions, they'd take 30 years to grow to that size.
Councillor Carl.
Just a quick question. If you look on page 65 of 78 in the board books, there seems to be a bit of confusion around the actual position and what will and what won't go as far as vegetation and the extent of that remnant, or what's it called, sensitive vegetation. You can see the location of the detention basin actually cuts into the edge of that crop of trees. So will those trees be removed in that, what I see from the overlays to be that sensitive area as far as vegetation under the state mapping, or will they remain?
If they were proposing to remove vegetation that was protected under state legislation, they would need an approval to do so. So I'm guessing, and I'm looking at our senior environmental officer, it's not mapped under under the Vegetation Management Act.
So that green area that goes underneath that watercourse there that you can see.
That's locally identified as under the planning scheme, so that's not at the state level, that's at the local level. So it's considered at the local level.
So it's irrelevant whether the vegetation is there or not. It could all go in order to facilitate the detention basin.
And that light green area that you can see on that plan, well, there's actually not much light green mapped because you've got the blue, which I think is actually the waterway. So there's not a great deal mapped actually on that site.
One doesn't cancel out the other. It's a non-riparian flow. It's a dry watercourse, so there'll be vegetation of significance there. So
well, actually, I think Shahida indicated, what was the state government department? That
they said that there is no riparian or alluvial
the state
vegetation.
government
It's just
actually was consulted and said there's no riparian, significant riparian vegetation. It's actually woodland.
Righto. So just to be clear, everything will probably go when that detention basin goes in.
I can't guarantee that, but I would guess that vegetation, yes, would be removed in order to establish the detention basin.
Okay, so if there's no further questions, can I have someone move that we reinstate standing orders? Councillor Taylor, Councillor Von Hoff, all those in favour? Now, Councillor Carl, did you want to move?
There's an amendment to the
Yeah.
recommendation. Through you, Madam Chair, maybe include the words "or as practicably possible" rather than immediately. On arrival, immediately might seem a bit arbitrary, especially if someone rolls in at 11:30 at night.
I just give you 2 seconds to think about that while I get my meetings procedures sorted out. We need the motion first, and then I'll get you to move the amendment.
As per the officer's recommendation, but probably, I don't know, what words would you place around that, Danielle, rather than immediately?
My only concern, if you put as soon as practicable, what does that mean? So you may have the issue where, you know, a resident says, oh, I brought my van in on Friday night and I was really busy getting organised, so 2 weeks later was when it was reasonably practicable for me to do it. So that's why I just would, you know, be a bit concerned around giving too much flexibility if your intent is that, you know, basically straight away they clean down the van before they leave it there.
Soon as practicable.
Okay, well, can I first of all have someone to move the officer's recommendation, and then I'll get you to move the amendment, Councillor Carl. Councillor Summerfield, have a seconder. Councillor McDonald. Now you do, sorry.
You've confused me, Madam Chair.
Well, I was under the impression that we needed the motion before you could amend the motion.
Yes, you do.
Yep. Okay.
Thank you. I'll get up to speed one day.
No, it's
Amendment.
Yeah, you're moving your amendment?
Amendment as per the officer's recommendation.
Okay, lovely. Do I need a seconder for the amendment? Yeah, you do. Yes. Can I have a seconder for Councillor Carl's amendment about the sign? Can everyone see the amended amendment there?
The condition doesn't ask them to do it, it just says.
Have I got this right? Have I got this right? Yep. So can I have a seconder for that? Councillor Carol Taylor has seconded that. So we have the amended motion there. All those in favour?
The amendment motion.
Sorry, but that we're voting on the whole motion with the...
we're voting on the amendment.
Voting on the amendment. Okay, so beg your pardon, sorry. So all those in favour of the amendment? Right, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4. The motion is lost. The amendment's lost. So now we're voting on the original recommendation. So all of those in favour? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8. So it must be 9. Beg your pardon. Can't count and I can't hold a meeting. Okay, thanks everyone for your indulgence. So that's the end of the meeting.